We hear the same thing every single year. Health insurance costs are increasing. And one of the big excuses for these never-ending increases is that prescription drugs are getting more expensive. And while that is true, the cost of produced drugs is increasing, I would argue it's marginal in comparison to what a middleman that most have never heard of has done to the cost of drugs. Because patients don't get pills from them and they don't make any drugs themselves, pharmacy benefit managers were able to stay under the radar historically, until relatively recently. But as some of the most profitable middlemen in healthcare, they're estimated to have generated just under $600 billion last year in revenue, they didn't hate that most people knew nothing about them. That worked in their favor. But we should know a lot more about pharmacy benefit managers. They control which drugs over 250 million Americans are allowed to take, how much those Americans are forced to pay for those medications, and where they can even go to buy them. So let's get into what PBMs do, how they make money, and 3 of the big controversies surrounding these guys. Let's dive in. Now, I think I've actually watched every single video on PBMs on YouTube, and that's because I wanted to see how others explained it. Admittedly, this is a very complex topic. There's already a lot of jargon in healthcare, and I think there's maybe more jargon around PBMs than 95 to 99% of other healthcare topics. So I'm gonna do my best to explain this in layman's terms and just break down the basics of pharmacy benefit managers. And I think the best way to do that is to start with what they do and who they do it for before getting into all the money. So PBMs primarily work for 3 groups. They work for the government, insurance companies, and American companies. Why these 3? Well, because these 3 offer insurance plans to patients and to their own employees. And PBMs run the drug part of the insurance plans for these 3 groups. So what does a PBM do for, say, a decent sized American company that runs their insurance in-house? This is how a majority of Americans get their insurance, by the way. Well, so for that company, first they need to figure out what drugs to include on their insurance plan for their employees. So the first thing that the PBM does is create something that's called a formulary for this company. A formulary is just an insurance term that means a list of approved drugs that the company will offer to their employees. And to make this list, the PBM will go out to all the different drug companies, get prices, and then decide which drugs will be chosen. And for these formularies, or the list of approved drugs for these employees, there's usually 4 different tiers. Tier 1 is generic drugs. This is the cheapest option. These are the everyday medications with the lowest copays for employees. Usually go to the pharmacy, pay $5 to $10. Tier 2 is the preferred brand name drugs. They cost more than generics, but insurance still covers a large portion of the cost, usually $20 to $40. Tier 3 is the non-preferred brand name drugs. So these are the expensive brand names without PBM discounts. Patients usually pay much higher copays. Think $60 plus. You're gonna pay significantly more for this tier than you would for tiers 1 or 2. And then tier 4 is specialty drugs. So this is the most expensive tier for complex chronic illnesses like cancer. So instead of a flat copay, patients usually pay a percentage of the massive total cost. So how does a pharmacy benefit manager go about choosing the drug or choosing which tier it should go on? Well, that's heavily dependent on something called rebates, which we'll get into in a second. But one thing I want to mention before is that if a drug isn't on this list, then the employee has to pay for it completely out of pocket. So what else do PBMs do for this hypothetical company? Well, second, they decide where these employees can go buy their medications. They'll build what's called a pharmacy network. So they'll contract with mom and pop pharmacies and more likely CVS and Walgreens, because some of these PBMs are actually owned by the same people who own CVS and Walgreens, and they'll create an approved list of pharmacies that these employees can go to. And if an employee does decide to go to a pharmacy that isn't on that list, the insurance usually won't cover it and you'll have to pay 100% out of pocket. And the third thing that PBMs do is once the employee goes to that approved pharmacy to pick up the approved drug, the PBM will process it. Meaning when the pharmacist scans their insurance card, that data goes straight to the PBM. In a second or two, their computer checks if the insurance is active, looks up what tier the drug is on, and decides exactly how much the insurance company pays versus how much cash that employee has to hand over. So to recap the basics of what they do, they control what drugs Americans can take, where they can go to buy them, and then they run the tech when they pay for them. So now you know the basics of the main things that PBMs do. Now let's take a look at how they make their money and some of the controversies. So why does this company even decide to work with a PBM? Why not just negotiate with the drug manufacturer or drug maker and get the drugs that they need themselves? Well, let's say this company that we've been talking about only has 100 employees, and they've got 4 employees who have diabetes and need insulin. Purely hypothetical, but this big drug manufacturer is not going to be offering any discounts for 4 employees. PBMs, on the other hand, have tons of companies that they negotiate for, and that's millions of insulin prescriptions, so they get major discounts, which is actually one of the ways that PBMs make their money. It's called a rebate. And before I explain it, check out this breakdown of what a rebate even is from KFF Health News. I think they do a really good job of explaining it.
Think of them like the coupons you send in when you buy a new brand of soap or an electronic gadget. Pop it in the mail, and a few months later, you get a check for $3. That happens with PBMs. but on a much larger scale.
Now, PBMs get to share drug rebates with the companies that they create that approved drug list for, or that formulary. And since PBMs work for hundreds of thousands of companies and so they represent millions of patients, they'll go to these 4 different drug manufacturers or drug makers that make insulin, and then they'll say, we'll put your expensive brand name diabetes drug on tier 2 of our formulary, meaning millions of people will buy it, but only if you give us a huge rebate. Then the drug manufacturers will compete to give the PBM the biggest rebate because they want their drug on tier 2 for all of those companies. Essentially, these drug companies are having to buy their way onto tier 1 or tier 2 of these approved insurance lists. To reiterate, if the drug isn't on tier 1 or tier 2, the drug company is losing out on a lot of money because if one of those employees want it, they'll have to pay for it out of pocket versus the company insurance plan covering most of it. So let's give a hypothetical. Let's say those 4 drug companies give their list price and then also the rebate price that they're willing to pay that PBM to get on a better tier. If you look at this chart, the obvious choice is option 1. The PBM would get the cheapest price for the company, but hold up, remember the PBM gets to share the rebate. So that's not the one the PBM's gonna pick. The PBM's gonna pick Pharma Company 3. Why? Because even though that drug has the highest sticker price at $300, it also comes with the biggest rebate, a $70 check that gets split between the PBM and the company after the drug is sold. And that's for every single drug that's bought at the pharmacy. Again, the bigger the rebate check, the more money that they make. And that actually means that they have a financial incentive to choose the highest priced drug if it has the biggest rebate. So the PBM takes Pharma Company 3, slaps it onto tier 2 of the company's formulary, and ignores the cheaper options. And the PBM could even tell the company that they're making this approved drug list for that it got them the biggest discount out there. They don't actually have to reveal the cost of the other drugs. And I'll get into why this is bad for patients in a second, but how else do PBMs make money? Well, another big way is through something called spread pricing, or a spread, which in and of itself has created a lot of controversy lately. Now remember, I said that the PBM does 3 big things, and that's related here. They make those approved drug lists for our company, they determine what those employees pay for the meds that they need, and third, they choose where those employees can go to buy them and basically do that whole drug processing thing we mentioned at the pharmacy. So think about that for a second. They basically work with the company in that interaction, but they also work with the pharmacy as well. So the PBM writes one contract with the company and a completely separate contract with the pharmacy. And the crazy thing is that neither side is allowed to see what's in the other one's paperwork. So let's continue that previous example. Let's look at how this plays out with the exact same company 3 insulin. The PBM goes to the company and says, hey, for this insulin, the sticker price is $300. But good news, we negotiated a $50 rebate for you. So it's only gonna cost you $250. So the company thinks the PBM did a great job getting a discount, it pays $300, but they're gonna get a $50 rebate later. Basically $250. What that company doesn't know is that that total rebate check was actually $70, and the PBM just quietly pocketed $20 of it for themselves. But where it gets worse is the spread part here. Then the PBM turns around to the pharmacy that actually handed the insulin to that company's employee and says, we're gonna only pay you $200 for that insulin. Take it or leave it. The pharmacy has no choice but to accept that $200 because if they don't, the PBM will kick them out of the approved network of pharmacies, and then they're gonna lose out on thousands of customers. And because the PBM actually runs the billing software at the register, their system automatically charges the employer the $250, pays the pharmacy $200, and then they pocket that $50 difference. That $50 is the spread. So on the single prescription, the PBM made a secret $20 off the rebate and a secret $50 off the spread. It's a completely hidden markup on millions of drugs every single day. And PBMs also make money through administration fees with those companies and different things, but that's for another video. Let's get into 3 of the big controversies surrounding PBMs. Now, you might be thinking, if a big drug company has to hand over massive rebates to get on these approved insurance lists or these formularies, aren't they losing a lot of money? Well, no, because they're not stupid. They already know that they're gonna have to pay these big rebates to PBMs to play the game, to make it onto the formulary. So what do? Here's what the former CEO of a major drug company speaking before Congress said.
If you bring a product to the market with a low list price in this system, you get punished financially and you get no uptake because everyone in the supply chain makes money as a result of a higher list price.
Basically, it creates this vicious cycle where the list price of medications keeps going up and up and up every single year just so that PBMs can negotiate bigger discounts, even though the actual cost to make the medication maybe hasn't changed that much. And besides the company, this brings us to another person who pays this inflated price, the patient. Remember, if you're prescribed an expensive tier 3 or tier 4 specialty drug, you usually aren't paying a flat $10 copay. You're gonna be paying a percentage of the total cost, like 30% coinsurance, or you're paying completely out of pocket until you hit your high deductible. Well, the problem is here, your bill at the pharmacy register is based off that inflated initial list price that the drug company sets. It's not based off the secret rebate that the PBM made, because that's secret. Now, you'd think that companies that are using these PBMs are at least saving money, but it's hard to say. Because PBM contracts are basically a giant black box, many employers are flying totally blind. When a company suspects that they're being overcharged and asks to see the receipts, like, hey, what did you actually pay the pharmacy versus what you charged us? The PBM could just say no. They actually write clauses into their contracts calling the real drug costs confidential trade secrets. So even though some employers believe that they're getting these incredible deals from PBMs because they see these rebate checks, they might actually be paying more than they needed to. And when the company's overall healthcare costs go up as a result, they either need to eat that or ask the employees to pay a larger share. Now, this is just a basic breakdown of how PBMs work. We're just scratching the surface here. I'll be dropping a future video going much deeper into the system, but you can check out my video on how pharmaceutical companies play a part in exorbitant drug prices here. This is Tyler Dutchover. Thanks for watching.